Whalers franchise was born in November of 1971, awarded by the World Hockey Association to 4 New England businessmen, led by Howard Baldwin. They began play in Boston, ambitiously signing former Red Wings star Tom Webster, hard-hitting Bruins defenseman Ted Green, and Penguins goalie Al Smith. To fill out the roster, the Whalers signed a large number of American players, including Massachusetts natives and former U.S. Olympians like Larry Plow and Paul Hurley. Among them were also Minnesotans Timothy Sheehy and Tommy Williams, who had strong ties to Boston through Boston College and the Bruins. The Whalers had a stellar first year, finishing first in the 1972-73 regular season. Webster led the team in scoring and steered them through the playoffs. And under the guidance of legendary Boston University head coach Jack Kelly, the team triumphed over the Winnipeg Jets to win the inaugural AVCO Cup championship. The Whalers' home games were split between the Boston Garden and the Boston Arena, but the antiquated arena and the Garden's priority scheduling, favoring the Bruins and Celtics, and even the American Hockey League's Boston Braves, posed significant challenges. Frustrated by these limitations, Baldwin made the tough decision to move the team. Hartford was on the cusp of unveiling a new downtown arena, which just happened to be situated in the middle of a mall. Originally intended to host an American Basketball Association team, those plans fell through, and the city reached out to the Whalers. At the start of 1974-75, the Civic Center was still under construction, so the Whalers started their season in West Springfield, Massachusetts. On January 11, 1975, they finally played their first game in Hartford, and were greeted by a sellout crowd, who they treated to a 4-3 overtime victory over the San Diego Mariners. The Whalers would remain in Hartford until they moved to North Carolina for the 1997-98 season, other than another brief interlude in Springfield in the late 1970s. The second stint in Springfield was necessitated by a catastrophic roof collapse at the Hartford Civic Center caused by heavy snow and rain that revealed several engineering and construction flaws. Despite never reclaiming the AVCO Cup, the New England Whalers consistently performed well, never missing the WHA playoffs and clinching their division title 3 times. They boasted a stable roster, with players like Rick Lay, Tom Webster, and Larry Plow each playing over 350 games for the club. The team's most notable acquisition came in 1977, when they signed Gordie Howe and his sons Mark and Marty. In 1978, the Whalers reached the finals, with a veteran team led by the Howes, with 50-year-old Gordie leading the team in scoring. The roster also included future NHL stars like Gordie Roberts and Mike Rogers, as well as former NHL stars like John McKenzie and Dave Keon. As one of the most stable teams in the WHA, the Whalers were one of the 4 franchises admitted to the NHL when the rival leagues merged in 1979. The Whalers retained most of their players when they transitioned to the NHL, where they changed their first name from New England to Hartford.
Coming to center, a pass over the line to Gordie Howe. Gordie Howe shoots one. He did it!
They changed their name at the insistence of the Boston Bruins, who objected to the team's use of New England as part of their moniker. To create a fresh identity, Connecticut-based graphic designer Peter Good was hired to design a new logo. He put a whale's tail over a W, with the negative space between the 2 shapes forming an H. This clever design became iconic, and symbolized the team's new era. Good also assisted in designing the team's new uniforms, featuring the Whalers' iconic green and blue. Upon joining the NHL, the Whalers were placed in the Norris Division of the Wales Conference, and their first NHL season in 1979-80 looked promising. In addition to standout players like Mike Rogers, Dave Keon, Gordie Howe, and longtime goalie Al Smith, the Whalers acquired Bobby Hull at the trade deadline. They finished the season with 73 points and earned a playoff berth, boasting the best record among the 4 former WHA franchises. This achievement made the Whalers, alongside the Oilers, the most recent first-year expansion franchises to make the playoffs, until the 2017-18 Vegas Golden Knights. In the first round of the playoffs, the Whalers faced the formidable Montreal Canadiens. Despite their efforts, they were swept 3 games to none.
En surtemps. L'homme de l'heure chez les tricolores, Yvon Lambert, a donné la victoire aux Canadiens avec l'aide de Houle et Tremblay après 29 secondes seulement de jeu. Cette victoire pourrait toutefois être coûteuse puisque Lafleur a été blessé à un genou, rappelons-le, et a dû quitter le match.
Following the season, the Whalers experienced a significant emotional blow as Gordie Howe, Bobby Hull, and Andre Lacroix all announced their retirements from professional hockey.
Howe coming up on the right side. Howe over the line to his father. Son to father. Back into. They score! Number 9.
Worsening the situation, the team's reputation for making disastrous trades began to unfold. In an effort to gain depth, the Whalers traded away stars for mediocre players, resulting in a series of disappointing outcomes. They traded star defenseman Mark Howe and their first NHL scoring leader Mike Rogers in separate deals for players and draft picks that never panned out.
This trade will be talked about for some time to come. The Whalers early this evening announcing that really it's their biggest trade to date, one that many thought would not and could not be made. Mark Howe, who came to the New England Whalers in 1977 along with father Gordie and brother Marty, has been traded to the Philadelphia Flyers in return for center Ken Linseman, left wing Greg Adams, and the Flyers' #1 draft choice next year. The Whalers then sent Linseman along with forward Don Nachbauer to the Edmonton Oilers in return for defenseman Risto Siltanen and 18-year-old left wing Brent Loney.
And they swapped defenseman Gordie Roberts, who would go on to play 15 more professional seasons, for Mike Fiddler, who only played half the remaining season in the NHL. In 1981-82, the Whalers moved to the Adams Division, where they developed a heated rivalry with the Bruins, fueled by the proximity of Boston, just 100 miles northeast of Hartford, and their shared history of playing in the same arena. The team's performance hit rock bottom in the 82-83 season, with a dismal record of 19-54-7, ranking 20th out of 21 teams in the NHL standings. In May of 1983, in a bid to turn things around, the Whalers hired Emile Francis as their new general manager, and 2 months later, he brought in Jack Evans as the Whalers' new head coach. By the end of the 1986-87 season, Francis had overhauled the team, cutting or trading away every player from the 1983 Whalers roster except for Ron Francis, Paul McDermott, and Paul Wallace. The Whalers entered the 1985-86 season looking like a playoff contender. By the end of January, they had a promising record of 26-20-1. But their momentum was halted when they lost franchise player Ron Francis and star goal scorer Kevin Dineen to injuries. They struggled through February, winning just 2 games, and facing the possibility of missing the playoffs for the 6th consecutive year. But the returns of Francis and Dineen revitalized the team, and the Whalers finished 4th in the Adams Division, earning a playoff berth for the first time since 1980. In round 1, they swept the first-place Quebec Nordiques in 3 games, marking their first NHL Series victory in Hartford. In round 2, they pushed the Montreal Canadiens to 7 games, but lost the decisive game 2-1 in overtime.
Trying to move it in front. Lemieux on the back end. He scores! Claude Lemieux with a high backhander at 5:55 of overtime has won the series for the Montreal Canadiens.
The Habs went on to defeat the Rangers in the conference finals, before taking down the Flames in 5 games to claim the Stanley Cup. 1986-87 saw the Whalers win their first division championship, finishing the season with 93 points. They were led by centers Ron Francis and Ray Ferraro, winger Kevin Dineen, defenseman Ulf Samuelsson, superstar goalie Mike Liut, and scorer Sylvain Turgeon. For the second year in a row, the Whalers drew the Nordiques in the opening round. Despite starting the series with 2 home victories, the Whalers were thrown off their game by the Nordiques' chippy style of hockey. And after dropping games 1 and 2, the Nordiques won 4 in a row to take the series in 6 games. The Whalers made the playoffs the next 5 consecutive seasons, but couldn't get past the first round. The 1989-90 season was one of the most interesting in Whalers history. It was highlighted by captain Ron Francis achieving career highs in goals with 32, assists with 69, and points with 101. But the season took a controversial turn at the trade deadline, when first-year general manager Eddie Johnston made a series of destructive trades. The most significant was sending franchise goalie Mike Liut to the Washington Capitals in exchange for center Ivan Korovo. Their franchise goalie was having a career year, and his departure left the Whalers with sophomore goalie Peter Sidorkiewicz as the starter and rookie Kay Whitmore as the backup. In the opening round of the playoffs, the Whalers faced their arch rivals, the Boston Bruins. With the Whalers leading the series 2-1, they were ahead 5-2 entering the third period of Game 4 at home. Bruins starter Reggie Lemelin, who'd struggled throughout the series, was replaced by backup Andy Moog. At the same time, Sidorkiewicz began to falter, allowing the Bruins to score 4 unanswered goals and win the game 6-5. He struggled for the rest of the series, while Moog turned in spectacular performances for the Bruins. Without Liut, the Whalers had to decide whether to stick with the struggling Sidorkiewicz or turn to the unproven rookie Whitmore. They stayed the course, and Boston won the series in 7 games. The Bruins ended up going all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they lost to the Oilers in 5 games. Whalers fans were dealt another blow in 1990-91, when Eddie Johnston traded Ron Francis, along with Ulf Samuelsson and Grant Jennings, to the Pittsburgh Penguins in exchange for John Cullen, Zarley Zalapski, and Jeff Parker.
I think we could have gotten a lot more from Ronnie Francis, and in my book, I think he'll still always be the captain of the Whalers. He's been a real good, hard player for them. That's all I got to say.
Oh, we've been season ticket holders since way back in World Hockey. And we really like Ronnie Francis. Felt he gave everything to Hartford, and I'm sorry to see him gone.
Francis was one of the most beloved players in Whalers history and held nearly every one of the franchise's significant offensive records. The trade was fiercely condemned by Whalers fans, despite a Hockey News article that said the Whalers won the deal. Cullen and Zalapsky played a handful of solid seasons with the Whalers, but Parker played just 4 games before injuries ended his NHL career. The trade was made more painful when Francis and Samuelsson promptly helped lead the Penguins to 2 consecutive Stanley Cups. Making matters even worse, Eddie Johnston, the Hartford general manager responsible for the trade, followed Francis and Samuelsson to Pittsburgh 2 years later to take over as the Penguins' head coach. The Johnston era proved disastrous for the Whalers, and the emotional fallout among the fanbase was significant. The Francis trade became a symbol of the Whalers' mismanagement and marked a turning point for the franchise, one from which they never fully recovered. The Whalers made their final playoff appearance in 1992 under the coaching of Jimmy Roberts, despite winning just 26 games. At the time, the top 4 teams in each division made the playoffs, regardless of their record. The Whalers had the good fortune of being in a 5-team division with the lowly Quebec Nordiques, who finished the season with just 20 wins. They faced the heavily favored Montreal Canadiens in the first round of the playoffs. After falling behind 2-0 by a combined score of 7-2, it looked like the Whalers were going to get swept. But back at the Civic Center in Hartford, the Whalers came alive, taking games 3 and 4 to send the series back to Montreal tied at 2 games apiece. With momentum on their side, the Whalers jumped out to a 3-1 lead in Game 5. But the Habs turned up the heat midway through the second, and went on to score 4 unanswered goals in the last 5 minutes of the period. The Whalers ended up losing the game 7-4, and again it looked like the Habs were too much for them to handle. But back home for Game 6, the Whalers bounced back with a dramatic 2-1 overtime victory, with Ivan Korovo scoring just 24 seconds into the extra frame.
Puck is moved across center ice by Zalapsky. Pollard, number 14, faced by Craven. A chance for the they score! Korovo scores! And the Hartford Whalers win! And we go back to Montreal for a 7th game.
The series shifted back to the Forum for a decisive Game 7, where the Whalers lost a heartbreaking double overtime thriller by a score of 3-2. The series marked the last time the Whalers would qualify for the playoffs while based in Hartford. Following the playoff run, head coach Jimmy Roberts and general manager Eddie Johnston were both fired. At the end of Johnston's 3-year tenure, only 7 players remained from the Whalers roster before he took over. The emotional highs of the 1992 playoff run were a sharp contrast to the subsequent dismantling of the team, which marked a clear end to an era. That summer, the Whalers hired Brian Burke as their new general manager, and Burke brought in Paul Holmgren as the team's head coach. Holmgren immediately named Pat Verbeek the new captain, and put him on a line with young stars Andrew Castles and Jeff Sanderson. The Whalers also acquired goaltender Sean Burke, in exchange for former first-round draft pick Bobby Holig. Future star Michael Nylander also began his NHL career with the Whalers during the 92-93 season. It was a rebuilding season for the Whalers, who finished with just 58 points, the second least in franchise history, and missed the playoffs for the first time since 1985. Despite this, the Whalers entered the 93-94 season with high hopes, buoyed by a core of young players. They drafted defenseman Chris Pronger, who started his NHL career alongside veteran Brad McCrimmon. But turmoil struck at the management level when Brian Burke announced his resignation to take an executive position with the NHL due to disagreements with Whalers owner Richard Gordon. Holmgren assumed the dual roles of head coach and general manager, but soon found the responsibilities overwhelming. He appointed Pierre Maguire as the new head coach, but the change did little to improve the team's performance, as Maguire was unpopular with the players. And later that season, 6 players and 2 assistant coaches were arrested in Buffalo after a barroom brawl. 19-year-old Chris Pronger was among those arrested. Around the same time, Holmgren checked himself into rehab after being arrested for drinking and driving. In the end, the Whalers finished the season with 63 points, a mere 5-point improvement from the previous season. On a positive note, Sean Burke emerged as the team's starting goaltender, and Brian Propp scored his 1,000th career point, before announcing his retirement at the end of the season. In the summer of 1994, the Whalers were purchased by Peter Karmanos, along with partners Thomas Thews and Jim Rutherford. Rutherford became the team's new general manager, and Holmgren returned as head coach. The new owners aimed to turn the team into a winner for the lockout-shortened 1994-95 season. Rutherford hit the free agent market and signed Jimmy Carson and Stephen Rice. And on draft day, the Whalers selected highly touted prospect Jeff O'Neill in the first round.
I don't know if there's anyone's, but Pierre, you can pick one.
I'm going with my comrade, Jeff O'Neill. And the biggest reason why, there's so much to see. They couldn't find a hockey stick big enough to protect the girth.
That's right.
So I think it'd be awesome.
Wow.
Rutherford also acquired defenseman Glenn Wesley from the Boston Bruins in exchange for 3 first-round draft picks. Despite these acquisitions, the Whalers stumbled out of the gate, and their fans' hopeful cheers turned to murmurs of disappointment, as the team started with a record of 2-7-2. But in mid-February, a spark of hope ignited. Led by their top line and starting goalie Sean Burke, the Whalers began to find their rhythm. For the next 30 games, they posted a promising record of 16-11-3, and it looked like the playoffs were within reach. The atmosphere in the Civic Center vibrated with renewed energy as the fanbase started to believe. But as the season drew to an end and the lights got brighter, the Whalers faltered, losing 6 of their final 7 games. The dream of a playoff berth, which had seemed so close, slipped away as the Whalers missed the playoffs by 4 points. By the end of the season, Whalers management had grown impatient with the slow development of Chris Pronger, so that summer, Pronger was dealt to the St. Louis Blues in exchange for Brendan Shanahan. Shanahan was disgruntled with the trade, so in an attempt to appease him, the Whalers immediately named him team captain. They started the 1995-96 season strong, winning their first 4 games. But the early success quickly faded, and the team struggled through the rest of 1995. In response, Paul Maurice was brought in to replace Holmgren as head coach. At just 28, he became the second youngest head coach in NHL history, a couple of years behind Gary Green, who was 26 when he took the helm of the Washington Capitals in 1979. A turning point came on December 28, 1995, when the Whalers reacquired one of their most popular players from the 1980s, Kevin Dineen. His return brought a morale boost, and his skills and leadership had an immediate impact on the team. The Whalers began playing significantly better in January, but despite a strong second half, they couldn't overcome their poor start. The team missed the playoffs for the 4th year in a row, leaving the players and the fanbase exasperated. Fans became more disillusioned when, prior to the 96-97 season, Brendan Shanahan voiced his displeasure about playing in Hartford and demanded a trade due to the small market and the team's uncertain future. His comments drew condemnation from fans and local media, leading to his immediate removal as captain, with Kevin Dineen taking over the role. After just 2 games, Shanahan, along with Brian Glynn, was traded to the Detroit Red Wings for Keith Primo, Paul Coffey, and a first-round draft pick. Despite the early season disruptions, the Whalers got off to a strong start, putting together a record of 14-7 in 6 through 27 games. The team was powered by a formidable first line of Sanderson, Castles, and Dineen, and complemented by a solid second line of Primo O'Neill and Sami Kapanen. But the promising start began to unravel in the second half of the season. A 9-game losing streak in January, followed by a 6-game losing streak in March, hurt their playoff hopes. Despite their poor performance down the stretch, the Whalers still had a chance to make the playoffs in the final week of the season. Unfortunately, losses on the road to the Senators and Islanders eliminated them from playoff contention. Meanwhile, the franchise was also struggling off the ice. Owner Peter Karmanos had pledged to keep the Whalers in Hartford for at least 4 years, when he purchased the team back in 1994. But by 1996, frustrated by lackluster attendance and limited corporate support, he announced that the team would likely move if they couldn't increase season ticket sales for the 1996-97 season. In a strategy aimed at attracting corporations and wealthier individuals, ownership only offered full season ticket packages, eliminating the popular 6, 10, and 20-game mini-packs. Sales were underwhelming at the start of the campaign, and it remained uncertain whether the Whalers would stay in Connecticut. An aggressive civic campaign, along with the efforts of many dedicated fans, which came to be known as the Save the Whale campaign, helped the Whalers sell 8,500 season tickets in less than 45 days. This represented an increase of over 3,500 tickets from the existing base, and came despite the Whalers raising ticket prices by 20% and increasing the deposit for season tickets. While the increased ticket sales were promising, the Whalers were also in need of a new arena. The Civic Center was over 20 years old, the roof had already collapsed, and with a capacity of under 15,000 and limited luxury seating options, the opportunities for additional revenue generation were limited, especially compared to the state-of-the-art buildings opening around the league, with capacities approaching 20,000 and lots of luxury seating. In early 1997, Connecticut Governor John Rowland stated his hesitancy to use public money to fund a new arena in Hartford. Despite this, early negotiations between the Whalers and Rowland looked promising. But talks fell apart when Karmanos asked for an additional $45 million to cover losses during the 3-year construction period. Once it was clear that he wasn't getting his arena, Karmanos announced the Whalers would be leaving Hartford after the 1996-97 season. And he made the announcement despite the fact he hadn't secured a new location. He initially looked at moving the Whalers to Norfolk, Virginia, where they would have been called the Hampton Roads Rhinos. But that possibility fell through after a failed season ticket drive and no prospect of getting a suitable arena. So when the Whalers played their final game in Hartford, on April 13, 1997 against the Lightning, they still didn't have a home for the following season. Finally, on May 6, 1997, Karmanos announced that the team would move to Raleigh, North Carolina, where they'd become the Hurricanes. The Canes played their first 2 seasons at Greensboro Coliseum, while awaiting the completion of their new arena in Raleigh. In 1999, the Hurricanes moved into the Raleigh Entertainment and Sports Arena, now known as PNC Arena, where they still play to this day. The move marked the end of an era for the Whalers, and the beginning of a new chapter for the franchise in North Carolina. Unlike some defunct teams, the Whalers continue to occupy a special place in the collective consciousness of hockey fans. I think a big part of that is their iconic logo and uniforms, which the Hurricanes continue to honor. Another reason is the Whalers' iconic traditions, like the still active Hartford Whalers Booster Club, the enduring presence of mascot Pucky the Whale, and the most iconic theme song in hockey history. That's all for this look back at the Whalers. Drop your thoughts down in the comments. And if you liked this video, please like and subscribe to support the channel.